Alright, let's do a tier list. Patch 10.1 Embers of Neltharion is literally right around the corner, and like many of you, I am curious on which tank will be strongest. There is so much that we need to keep in mind when looking at meta specs. There are obvious things like class tuning, but more importantly, and sometimes a little bit more subtle, is content design. In this video, I'm going to try to really dissect my rationale of how I rank tanks going into this next season, so let's talk about it. I'm going to be brief on this, and it's going to honestly be a pretty wild guess. For those who don't know, I typically don't make raid content. While I do partake in casual Mythic raiding, it's mostly for specific items, so I typically focus on Mythic+. Also, more often than not, the tank role doesn't really matter outside of some of the top % of guilds, but this time around, it's a little bit more unique because for the first time in a long while, we are seeing a very heavy single target raid tier. This is important for a few reasons. DPS classes that are typically more favorable in AoE will find it harder to work their way into an ideal composition. While in some cases that doesn't really matter, there are certain classes that provide extremely powerful group buffs, including Monk and Demon Hunter. They typically provide things like Chaos Brand or Mystic Touch, which is a 5% increase to your entire raid's magical or physical damage respectively, and that's against all targets afflicted by the debuff. Without picking it apart too much, we can look at the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Their tier set increases their fire damage by a flat amount and provides them with a free proc of Fiery Brand. In earlier PTR testing, you can actually get this to proc roughly every 30 seconds. Keep in mind that this is only at 413 item level, which is really low. While this set is pretty mediocre in AoE situations, in single target it's extremely consistent and it provides the DH with a 40% damage reduction whenever the target is afflicted by Fiery Brand. This is an underappreciated blanket for most incoming raid damage. Vengeance Demon Hunters also have really high self-healing and some great utility with Sigil of Silence, Misery, and Chains. Granted, some of those choices are harder to get to, but they are there if they're needed. Every tank has pros and cons, and for 99% of guilds, the tank choice won't matter. All I'm saying though is play what you want, but I think that we're going to be seeing a few more Vengeance Demon Hunters in order to make an ideal composition for some of the top guilds looking to optimize their damage. Okay, let's talk about the good stuff. Mythic Plus. We are being introduced to the 3 new affixes, and based on the new rotation, we're going to be seeing these extremely often. If you missed me explaining some of those affixes, you can go check out that video here, as long as I remember to put it in the corner. 1 snares players, 1 requires an interrupt or single target CC, and 1 requires a dispel or healing. These are all attached to the level 7 keystone affix, meaning that 60% of the weeks you're going to have to deal with one of these, so I think it's pretty important to keep them in mind. Now, you can argue that this can depend on your group comp, and a weaker class can just invite a class that can handle the affix better, which is a fair argument, but I think we're trying to predict the meta here, so a tank that won't struggle with any affix will result them being stronger than the others. The new dungeon pool is also pretty unique. We have things like Freehold and Underrot coming back into the rotation, which are pretty heavy with physical damage. While most tanks can handle physical damage better than others, it definitely favors something like their Protection Warrior. But we also have some other dungeons, like Brackenite Hollow, which possesses an insane amount of required dispels, including both poison and disease. Vortex Pinnacle and Halls of Infusion have a stupid amount of casts, and Neltharis, well, Neltharis is just cool. I'm not going to spend very long on this, but basically the new pools feel to me that it wants a tank that takes very little damage, both magical and physical, preferably a disease dispel, and plenty of damage and utility. Alright, starting it off, we're going to put the Demon Hunter down in the C tier. Sorry DH fans, this is for a few reasons though. First, their tier set is extremely catered to single target and becomes very difficult to properly use in AoE. While it's possible to build upon the tier set by using the talent tree, simply due to the shitty pathing, you're going to need to sacrifice some pretty important talents in order to do so, and most likely won't be worth. While Sigil of Silence is really strong as a group utility, there are a ton of dispel requirements in these new dungeons, and not having access to one, while many other tanks do, just puts them in a tough spot. That's not to say that you can't push high keys as a DH. They still have a great damage profile, and a well-played DH will require little healing from their healer, especially with the new tier set in single target, but what concerns me the most is all of the casters, dispels, and the new affixes. While keeping in mind casters, dispels, and the new affixes, let's move on to the warrior. The Protection Warrior I think will be a solid B tier tank. They still have a lot going on for them. They feel basically immune to any type of physical damage, especially when taking auto attacks from mobs into account. They also still possess a lot of powerful defensives and utility like Growling Cry, Shockwave, Intimidating Shout, and Stormbolt. Warrior's weakness, though, has always been the onslaught of magical damage, which you may actually find more common in Mythic Plus Season 2. Their kit falls extremely short in terms of the new affixes. First, they lack a Dispel, which I think is going to hurt them when it comes to the new affix Afflicted, but also some of the dungeons like Halls of Infusion and Brackenhide. Secondly, they're one of the only classes that don't possess any long-term CC for the Incorporeal affix. The new tier set is also extremely lackluster. Personally, I really enjoy the tier set, but the bonus damage mostly results in higher shield slam damage, and the 4 set turns your last stand into an offensive cooldown, which can be problematic in higher keys, especially for those players who start planning where they're going to be using their defensives. The tier set also doesn't provide as much burst. You have to wait until last stand actually expires before you get the damage buff. Speaking of rage-based tanks, next we have the Guardian Druid, which surprisingly I think is going to be able to perform a little bit better than the Protection Warrior, and for a few reasons. First and foremost, they have access to Dispels. While they can't cleanse diseases necessarily, they can cleanse both curses and poisons, which you're going to find in a lot of these dungeons. I do want to mention though that it's not the easiest talent to grab, and it requires a lot of talent point shuffling, but it's there if it's needed. The main reason I want to rate bears so high is their tier set. It plays into increased damage with most of your offensive spells, bolstering both Mangle and Thrash damage, as well as Maul and or Raise, depending on what you're talented into. With that, it can potentially open up Ursoc's Fury as a talent option, again providing a ton of absorption, which can help mitigate a lot of the magical damage. Beyond that, the new tier set also gives bears a stagger type damage mitigation, where it heals you based on the recent damage you took. With the minor buff to mastery recently, as well as the tier set and the recent health buff, bears are going to have some pretty insane health pools moving into next season, with Incarn allowing you to get over 1 million health. This season, they're just looking super stable. They're still going to suffer a little bit when it comes to damage, but overall they should be okay. Though, some damage buffs would be nice. We are now moving on to my top choices for tanks. Next, we have the Blood Death Knight. Truthfully, I've been all over the place where I want to rank this tank. If anything, this would be my dark horse choice. I can see them just being a bland old B tier, or by the end of the patch being insanely stupid strong. With the recent changes and updates to their tier set, I think they have a potential to be absolutely unkillable, which is why I would rank them so high. I know they've always been unkillable, but their tier set now allowing pretty common and often procs of Vampiric Blood, on top of also granting shields through Umbilicus Eternus, is just honestly stupid. Through most of my testing, it seems that Vampiric Blood can push upwards of 50% uptime. My major concern with them really comes down to their lack of dispels, and honestly really any major group utility to properly handle the new affixes. Blood Death Knight, in design, has always been a more selfish tank. Outside of Death Grips and Anti-Magic Zone, most of what they do really only benefits themselves. With the new affixes, Blinding Sleet won't really help them with Incorporeal, and neither will Death Grip, leaving them just with a range kick and maybe Asphyxiate if they talent into it. It's a pretty wild toss-up, but I'm eager to see how this tank performs in the hands of a capable player. Brewmaster would be my next tank, which will prominently fall into A tier. This class has had a pretty big glow up over the last patch, and I think going into next year they're really going to pack a punch. While their tier set is arguably pretty weak defensively in certain scenarios, they still have pretty substantial mitigation and self-healing to counter magical damage. Their utility kit is also pretty nice as well, containing Ring of Peace, Lake Sweep, and Paralysis. What really makes the Brewmaster shine is how much damage the tier set is actually providing. It has a lot of really cool synergy with Spinning Crane Kick bolstering talents like Counter-Strike and Charred Passions. Damage is a pretty major part of Mythic Plus, and playing with a tank that can put out as much damage as a DPS while also staying pretty healthy, and keeping packs under control is worth ranking them as an A tier tank. Though, nothing ranks even close to how Protection Paladins are stacking up for next tier. As most of you know, Protection Paladins have had a glow up of the century, with back-to-back buffs and reworks, catapulting them to the front runner and a clear favorite tank of the season. They have plenty of cooldowns to cycle through, seemingly infinite kicks, group utility with stuns and blinds, immunities, and of course a dispel. Outside of a mediocre tier set bonus, this tank is an all-encompassing package. This just seems like a season that really favors the Paladins, regardless of their power. They just have such a great kit to counter so many different aspects of every dungeon in this season. And that pretty much wraps it up. Casual reminder that tier lists should be taken with a grain of salt. A well-played class can still perform very well, so just don't be bad. Or you can just invite overpowered DPS classes. Let me know how wrong I am in the comments below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.